Hi, I'm Stephen Tryon, and I'm the founder of accountabilitycitizenship.org. In 2013, I published Accountability Citizenship and founded accountabilitycitizenship.org because of three trends that, in my view, make it much more difficult for us to be effective citizens. Here are those three trends. I'll let you go ahead and read that for yourself. The deregulation of television and radio basically happened in the 80s and 90s. The explosion of information technology, of course, started in the 70s and is ongoing. And the elimination of campaign finance rules really comes down to two Supreme Court decisions that happened in 2010 and 2014. That's where I want to focus tonight. And I want to focus on that because I think it's where we should start to address some of the challenges that we face as American citizens. First of all, I think it's something that we can all agree on, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. From talking to my friends at work after this last election cycle, we were all just sick of the campaign advertising that we all had to put up with for this cycle. And the reason why we had that horrible deluge of bad campaign ads is because there are no effective restrictions on campaign finance. So if we were to reinstitute some effective restrictions on campaign finance, we would probably improve the quality of our lives as we go through these election cycles by reducing the amount of terrible campaign ads that we have to suffer through. The other reason why I think we should start by talking about campaign finance rules is that the elimination of campaign finance rules, in a very real sense, sets American democracy back 120 years. If you think about it, from the signing of the Constitution through the end of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution, businesses were largely unconstrained. Congress had its requirements to manage commerce between the states, but the actual execution of businesses, what they did and how they treated their workers, was largely left up to them. It wasn't until the end of the 19th century, in 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act, where the government started to step in and exert some controls over the larger businesses and monopolies in order to increase fairness and to make the economy work a little bit better. And really, it wasn't until Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, and I talk about that in my most recent book, What Makes a Great President, because Teddy Roosevelt was considered one of the four greatest presidents by the surveys that I used in this book. During a coal strike in 1902, Teddy Roosevelt called the parties together at the White House and actually acted as a neutral party. And up to that point, the government had always sided with management. But that was the first time that the government actually acted as a neutral party, which was a step forward for the average worker, because now they had somebody that was advocating for them, essentially, not just government leaning in on the side of management. And then if you fast forward another decade or so, you've got the direct election of senators. The 17th Amendment passes and is ratified in 1913. And so the progression of political power, economic power, has been moving in the direction of empowering individual citizens through this whole time. What we've done now with the elimination of campaign finance rules, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second, is we've shifted the balance back so that businesses have a lot more political power than individuals. Okay, so let's take a look at what campaign finance rules were and how they were changed. So here you see the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002 right there at the top, which updated the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971 to address some loopholes that appeared. If state political agencies were not restricted by the Federal Election Campaign Act, and they had figured out how to circumvent some of the federal restrictions. And so the BCRA, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, McCain-Feingold in the Senate and some different sponsors in the House came together to create this BCRA Act of 2002 to basically put some teeth into the federal laws regulating how campaigns are financed. And it restricted political contributions by corporations, restricted political contributions by labor unions, and it restricted the total maximum amount of contributions by individuals. So those three things were in place. They were challenged almost immediately. The first challenge was a case called Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. In January of 2010, the Supreme Court ruled that the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002 was unconstitutional, in that it was unconstitutional, according to the Supreme Court, to prevent political contributions by corporations and labor unions. So that opened the door for some big organizations to make contributions. Of course, there were still maximum contribution restrictions. And then McCutcheon versus Federal Election Commission, another suit that rose up to the level of the Supreme Court. And in April of 2014, the Supreme Court ruled that any limits on the total political contributions of any individual donor are unconstitutional as well. Now, there were still some restrictions on how much an individual or a corporation could donate to a particular campaign, but the combination of these two rulings allowed corporations to get around the restrictions because they could basically just create as many entities as they needed to create in order to make whatever size donation they wanted to make to an individual campaign. So, what was the reasoning of the Supreme Court? Well, the Supreme Court majority opinion relied on three premises. They equated the way a person spends their money, or the way a corporation spends money, with constitutionally protected free speech. And then they said that any restriction on political spending is therefore a restriction on free speech. And they said that the government has no compelling interest to make that restriction. So based on that, the Supreme Court ruled that VCRA restrictions are unconstitutional. All three of those premises, in my view, are unsound. And almost immediately after the McCutcheon versus FEC ruling came down, I published my counter argument to that ruling in American City and County Magazine. You can see the citation down there at the bottom of this slide. And it's also reprinted in my book, Close Encounters with Accountability Citizenship. Slightly different title, a little bit different wording. It's entitled in this book, There's Too Much Dark Money in Politics, but the citation for that is also there at the bottom. You can read my counter argument in more detail at those sources. Basically, the reason why I say that the Supreme Court got it wrong is that constitutionally protected free speech is a universal natural right. That's what the Constitution is aiming to protect with its Bill of Rights. It's protecting things like life, like liberty, like the pursuit of happiness. And it doesn't say, business owners have more of a right to life. Business owners have more of a right to liberty. It doesn't say that in the Constitution because they're talking about these things. We're talking about universal natural rights that apply to all human beings as human beings. And free speech is that kind of a right. It's a right that we all have in equal measure. But money, on the other hand, the money that's available to us to spend on politics or anything else is not something that we all have in equal measure. Moreover, because we live in a capitalist country where we think that the differences in income and the differences in rewards for doing different kinds of things help to make the society function more efficiently, we think it should be the case that people have different amounts of money. But trying to say that how much money we spend on a political campaign is the same thing as free speech is therefore equating two different kinds of things, a universal natural right that we all have in equal measure with, something that none of us ever have enough of, right? Money. Once you realize that constitutionally protected free speech is a different kind of a thing than the way we spend money on politics or anything else, then you can't really give political spending the protection of constitutional free speech. They're just apples and oranges. And once you realize that, then the second premise of the Supreme Court opinion, that a restriction on political spending is a restriction on free speech, also immediately goes away because they're not the same kind of things. And then the third part of the Supreme Court ruling, that the government has no compelling reason to restrict speech or spending in the political arena. If you look at the district court ruling that the Supreme Court overturned, the district court actually gets this right. The district court rules that the government does have a compelling interest in restricting spending in the political arena, and that interest is to reduce corruption. Spending on political advertising and spending in political campaigns, contributions to political campaigns are avenues of corruption. And so the government does have an interest in restricting how much money and what types of money and where that money can come from that can be applied to political campaigns. So all three of the premises of the Supreme Court majority opinion basically are unsound. So what does that mean? Well, if the Supreme Court's decision in McCutcheon and Citizens United is wrong, as I believe it is, then we should go to Congress and have our members of Congress write a new law that reestablishes something like the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act of 2002, reestablish those restrictions. And it'll be challenged again, it'll go to the court again, and the court will have an opportunity to make a new ruling. But that's the way we can get the court to correct itself, because the court's not always right. Now, when the Supreme Court makes a decision, that decision becomes the law of the land, and we all have to live by it. But they haven't always been right throughout history. In this book, What Makes a Great President, when I talk about the worst president in American history, James Buchanan, according to the surveys that I use in this book, one of the things that make him the worst president is his interference in a Supreme Court decision called Dred Scott. And Dred Scott was a decision where the court came down and ruled that slaves were property. It basically inflamed the tensions between pro-slavery and anti-slavery, and was considered one of the reasons why the Civil War happened. This bad Supreme Court decision. So the Supreme Court doesn't always get it right. And we have three co-equal branches of government: the judicial, the legislative, which is Congress, and the executive. And there's checks and balances between those three branches. And it's perfectly appropriate for us as American citizens, as I outline here in my first book, Accountability Citizenship, to go to our members of Congress and to request that they make a law to fix this thing that the Supreme Court has screwed up, basically, which is campaign finance. And not only will that help us keep corruption out of politics, but it'll also make our lives a little bit better as we go through these campaign cycles, because we won't have to deal with the horrible campaign ads that we've had to deal with here for the last little while. Well, anyways, that's my discussion on campaign finance reform. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll be back next week to talk about something different. I hope you have a good week, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye now.